What's up, Theory Creeps? I'm the Theory Creep, and today we're going to be talking about Freud. Now, I know that Freud isn't as popular as he used to be. He's definitely losing some clout, really across the theoretical spectrum. As far as I know, he's only really studied in literary circles these days. So Freud sees in his patients, who are veterans of World War I, that they are repeating instances of trauma, that they're coming back from these terrifying experiences, and they're obsessively or pathologically, or seemingly pathologically, reliving these scary moments. They can't stop imagining them, they can't stop seeing them, like they're haunted by them. So Freud wants to know why, and he understands this, or he offers us an understanding of this repetition through his grandson. So the grandson is at home all day. His father is off fighting the war, and his mother is spending most of her time having this affair with someone else living in Vienna. So Freud's grandson is left alone with Freud, and Freud sees him doing this strange, seemingly strange thing. He throws his toys out of his crib and then cries when they're gone and hopes that someone comes and puts them back in. Freud calls this the Fort Da game, which is German for here, there, or here, gone. Freud's theory is that the child is throwing his toys out of the crib in an attempt to reenact the loss of his father and the reoccurring loss of his mother as she comes and goes from his life, having this extramarital affair. I guess it's too bad Freud didn't have one of these. So the child is constantly being faced with loss. He's constantly getting his mother, Fort, and then losing his mother, Da. And he has no control over this because he's an infant. He can't even talk. So in order to deal with this lack of control, he takes over his trauma. He manifests his trauma. He represents his trauma through reenactment, through play. And this gives him a sense of control over something that he has no control over. And for Freud, control and agency are a really big part of why trauma is so awful. In Freud's mind, we're this self-contained agent. We have our internal world, and it has its drives and mechanisms, and we might not fully understand them, but they're self-contained. They're inside of us. And trauma, which I believe is Greek for pierce, so trauma comes in and penetrates our shell, and exposes us to the chaos of the world and robs us of agency. So for Freud, this piercing of our otherwise self-contained self and kind of the erosion of our control over our lives, these are central elements of why trauma is so terrible, and that's why we reenact trauma. Because like the baby, when we are reenacting a moment of losing control, we're in control. So this brings us to the subject of today's video, which is horror films, which are essentially just reenactments of trauma, right? Like the same way that a post-traumatic stress disorder survivor or a traumatized baby, in the case of the Fort Da game, in the same way that they reenact their loss of control through, nightmares, through play, through obsessive thinking, we reenact potential horror, or the kind of nebulous, kind of ambient, everyday horror of the modern world. We reenact that through horror films. They're a way for us to recreationally experience fear and manage the everyday fear that we feel every day. So we can understand horror movies through Freud's theory of Fort Da, through Freud's theory of reenactment as a way to manage trauma. And if we do that, we get a very useful tool in understanding modern culture, because we have hundreds, thousands of horror movies that have been made over the past 80 years. And as the subject of their horror changes, as what it is they're reenacting changes, we can kind of map those changes onto culture. So the first horror movies were extremely moralistic, right? You've got like Frankenstein, you've got like Dracula. These movies are about a knowable evil monster who can be rationally defeated by a rational agent. This also applies to early kind of horror sci-fi movies. You've got aliens showing up, but the aliens are defeated by the men in white coats and the men in uniforms and in fighter jets, and they manage the problem. So early horror movies are manifesting a fear that chaos will appear in a knowable, discrete entity, and it will penetrate our defenses in, a knowable, discrete place, and that a figure, an individual figure, using rationality and intelligence will manage this problem and make it go away. So early horror movies are a very obvious way to manage fear. They literally have management strategies built into their narratives. They're not a complete film until they've been resolved, usually by a man, usually a scientist or a detective or some other authority figure, and frankly, it usually gets him laid. Likewise, parodies of classical horror movies are pretty simplistic as well. You've got, Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. Dracula is kind of a playful trickster in this movie. He's kind of a bumbling buffoon. He's not really malicious. He's not scary. And Abbott and Costello, as opposed to being, individualistic figures of reason who are ordering the world, they're completely lost. They don't know what's going on. They're completely ineffective. To be honest, they barely know that Dracula is around in this movie. And the same thing in Frankenstein. It's just a reversal of those poles, right? Like just a straight up undermining of the expectation of rational individual versus discrete monster. Now, the discrete monster is a discrete comic relief, and the rational individual is, a bumbling comic relief. It's replacing fear with laughter. There's also more classical examples of horror parodies like Young Frankenstein and Dracula Dead and Loving It, both by Mel Brooks. Like, the tradition of parodying the classic monster story is definitely something that persisted well out of the golden age of cinema. So Freud is telling us that we manage fear by reenacting it. We relive the traumatic event as a way to gain control over the experience which robbed us of control traumatically and temporarily. So another way to manage this fear or to manage this trauma would be to laugh about it, right? Would be to passively accept what's going on and kind of chuckle at it instead of neurotically holding on to things and repeating them in a need to control. Laughter is a release of control. It's a reflexive action as opposed to a obsessive pathological action. And I really want to emphasize this, that horror parodies are important to us, the same way that horror movies are important to us, because they offer us another way to manage fear. The world kicks our ass on a daily basis. We have plans and they get undermined. We have dreams and they don't come true. We have understandings of things and they get undermined. We're constantly being shown that we're these insignificant little pieces of shit, really. And the world is just this giant force holding us down and fucking us up. And horror movies are, like I said, a way to manage that. When we watch a horror movie, we're in control. We could turn it off if we want. We're not in danger. Obviously, this isn't the case in real life. But horror parodies do the same thing. They give us a way to manage this insignificance. They give us a way to manage this fear that isn't scary. They let us manage fear with pleasure. It's very interesting. As our understanding of ourselves and the world has kind of evolved and become more nebulous and complicated, horror movies have followed suit. Now, the kind of simple monster of Dracula or Dr. Frankenstein, they don't play anymore. We see people like that complicated all the time in our daily lives, in the media, in our personal interactions. Nothing's as simple as good and evil. Like, everyone understands that there are these gray zones now. So modern horror films, or I guess I should say postmodern horror films, have become more nebulous. They've become less understandable. Like you've got movies like Alien, where we, especially in the first film, we never have any idea what's going on. We don't know what this thing is. We know they probably picked it up when they landed on this planet, but they don't know what it is. They don't know why. They don't know why it's killing them. It's kind of revealed like tacitly as the movie progresses that maybe this is all part of some corporate plan. So maybe the monster in Alien isn't the alien. Maybe it's corporate hegemony and corporate profit motives and corporate amorality. Maybe it's both. Maybe it's the monster and it's the corporation. Authority and the status quo, they're undermined, they're complicated, they're contaminated in the postmodern horror movie. They're clueless at best and dangerous at worst. Just look at Night of the Living Dead, where at the end you've got the sole surviving protagonist who just happens to be a black man, who gets mistaken for a zombie by an all-white sheriff's posse. Like, Authority in this movie is not the hero. In fact, it's revealed to be a more serious antagonist than the zombies. So we've identified 3 kinds of horror film. We've got the classical horror film, we've got the classical horror parody, and we've got the postmodern horror film. Now, the latter 2, the postmodern horror film and the parody of the classical horror film, they seem to be allies in the same war. Like, they seem to be trying to do the same thing. In a postmodern horror film, the scientist is often a raving lunatic or a madman and a mad scientist. The detective is often clueless, misinformed, misguided, chasing red herrings. There's no one to save you in any of these movies. Often the female protagonist, who in the past would rely on a man to save her, is left to save herself, like, for example, in Alien. While the monsters in classical horror parodies were funny and non-threatening and meant to undermine the kind of seriousness and scariness of the monsters in classical horror films, monsters in postmodern horror films are absolutely terrifying. They're nebulous and unknowable, and that makes them even scarier. So despite this difference, despite the fact that the parody film is non-threatening and the postmodern film very much is threatening, their goals are the same. They're both trying to get the audience to disregard Enlightenment values of an ordered universe. They're both trying to undermine the values of a classical horror film. They're just using different ways to do it. We might see the postmodern horror film as the child of the classical horror parody, because classical horror parodies were being made at the same time as classical horror films. So even as these Enlightenment values of, the masculine ordered authority figure were being expressed, they were being undermined. And maybe it was just a matter of time before the parodies of these films created postmodern horror films through their undermining of these values. Like, if we take the laughter of the classical horror parody as like a true satire, a true undermining, a true disruption of the dyads established in classical horror parody of good and evil, order and chaos, rationality and unknowability, etc. And the hierarchies, right? So that unknowability can be known by rationality, that it's subordinate to it. If horror parodies undermined these dyads and reversed these pairs, then it seems to me that postmodern horror was the natural result of the disruption of this dyad. So then there's a 4th category of horror film, and I think this is the category that Aqua Teen Hunger Force slips into most naturally. That is postmodern horror parody. Obviously, that's a thing, right? Postmodern horror films like Alien or Scream are very popular, so it makes sense that there'd be parodies and satires of them. There's a market for it, right? Like, if you go and see horror movies and you have a sense of humor, you're probably going to go and see horror parodies, whether or not they're postmodern or classical. So you've got things like Shaun of the Dead, Scary Movie, Student Bodies. These are parodies of postmodern horror film. So what's going on here? How do we approach these parodies Do we do it the same way that we did classical parodies, that they're undermining the seriousness of fear, that they're giving us another way to manage fear? I think so. Like I said, postmodern horror films are scary. They show us a world that we have no hope of understanding, that we're just completely powerless in. They present us with threats that we have no hope of overcoming, and that we have no hope of understanding. They show us that there's no one out there to save us, that we can't rely on authority figures or society or the establishment to manage these problems, that we are alone in the world and the world is really out to kill us. And not just the world, right? Like in postmodern horror films, you've got threats in the world, you've got material horror, and then you've also got this amaterial horror, this imagined horror. Like we'll be talking about a film called Targets in the near future, and that's about like a mass shooter, basically. So that's in the world, right? That happens. Unfortunately, it happens almost every day. So the fear of a mass shooter is material, it's physical, it's real. But then you've got postmodern horror movies like
Nightmare on Elm Street,
where the fear is 100% virtual. Like, yeah, sure, like you'll die if you die in your dreams. But like this is a virtual environment that we're seeing right now. We don't actually encounter Freddy Krueger in our day-to-day life, but we absolutely encounter mass shooters in our day-to-day life. So fear in a postmodern movie is in the world and outside of the world. And this reflects the ambient kind of fear in modern culture, that everywhere you look, things are not what they seem, that your understandings are faulty. Whether you're looking at the material world and you know rationally that there's this whole quantum mechanical kind of atomic physical world that you're not seeing that's driving the world around you, or whether you're just looking inside yourself and thinking about the drives that power you, the things that guide you, and how they're totally out of your control and subconscious, and how you don't really make the decisions that you make. You just follow these instinctive drives or these traumatic drives that the unconscious makes our decisions for us. In the modern world, chaos and order contaminate each other all the time. Good and evil mix, and we can't distinguish one from the other. Like, just think about like Obama, like who seems to have, for all intents and purposes, been a pretty ethical, effective president. But the number of drone strikes perpetrated under his leadership is really kind of troubling. And then you've got like Hillary Clinton, who again was like a much, much, much better choice for president than Trump. Like, I'm absolutely not dumping on Clinton and like lifting up Trump. But at the same time, there's a lot of issues with Clinton. She's kind of a war hawk.
We came, we saw, he died.
So no one's really good in the modern world. Everyone makes these decisions that are kind of morally suspect. There's no isolatable, identifiable moral center to our universe. Postmodern horror parodies give us a way to manage this unknowability that isn't fear. They let us look at the world and look at how unmanageable and unknowable and terrifying and violent it is, and they give us ways to laugh about it, which again, I think is a much, much, much better reaction than the two alternatives we've kind of tacitly already mentioned. So let's actually break them down explicitly. So you've got three ways to manage the world. The first is fear, which is obviously not really a choice. Like, we feel fear whether or not we want to, but we can either embrace that fear and relive it and try to gain control of it through repetition. And that's one approach. The other approach is to try to change the world, which was really the goal of the Enlightenment figure, the detective, the scientist, the classical horror movie protagonist. All of these people went out into the fucked up world and tried to manage it. And that's obviously, in my assessment, a suspect decision, right? Like, you're going into the world and trying to change things. Who says you're going to change them for the better? Like, who says that you know what the right thing to do is? And who's to say that on your path to making those changes, you're not going to have to make 100 compromises that undermine what you were trying to do at the beginning of your project? So changing the world, I think, is a mistake. Being afraid of the world, can't really say it's a mistake because it's a natural reaction, but it's not an effective reaction. I think the third reaction, which is laughter, is by far the healthiest, least pathological, most effective way to manage the horror of our daily lives. One, it's passive. It's not trying to change anything. There's kind of a beautiful acceptance to laughter, right? We look at something, and if it's terrifying and we laugh at it, we know that it's terrifying, and we know there's really nothing we can do about it, but it's a way to manage that terror. We're not living in the terror. We're dealing with it through laughter. So it's not active, which I like. And I also don't think it's pathological. I think that laughter is therapeutic, and I also think that laughter is not necessarily repetitive. I think that jokes get less funny over time. So maybe laughter is a way to deal with the terror of the world. Maybe we laugh at it one day, and maybe the next day it's not quite as funny. Maybe the next day it's a little bit more manageable. A lot of the theoretical work that I'm doing in this channel, you've probably noticed it's kind of opaque, right? Like, we're kind of talking about like old white dead dudes, like ancient Greek philosophers, theories of language, like these kind of broad, esoteric, abstract concepts. But the fact that they trickle down into horror parody, the fact that horror films and many, many, many other elements of pop culture, but in particular horror films, kind of manifest the shifts that we've also seen in philosophy, right? Like, as the Enlightenment has given away to postmodernism, so too has classical horror given away to postmodern horror films. And people can understand the changes in horror films much, much easier than they can understand the changes in, grand philosophical kind of paradigms. But the truth is, those changes are corollary. Like, you can really trace one onto the other. And if you can understand what happened in postmodern horror films versus classical horror films, like if you can understand that transition and what that transition means culturally, like not just that the monster got weirder and more nebulous and harder to nail down, but like what that might mean for what we're afraid of. And the fact that authority figures have gotten more and more kind of chaotic and less certain and helpful. Like, what does that mean for our relationship to authority and our relationship to truth in day-to-day life? Like, that's not a hard jump to make, to start talking about cultural changes when you've started talking about films. And I think that it's just an easier way to access these broad kind of cultural philosophical theories when you talk about particular cultural artifacts that manifest those theories. That concludes this video. I'm not sure what we've got coming up next. It might be more Murder and Other Humane Acts. It might go back to Isolation Switch and the Fan Man and online celebrities, or we might do another video analysis. I don't know. We'll see how I feel. Anyway, this has been The Theory Creep. I'm The Theory Creep. Thanks for joining, and hopefully we'll catch you next time.